picture this. It starts with a cacophony of chopping wood, of people shouting, of roosters crowing, and in between that, the small steps of tiny feet, wearing a mismatched pair of rubber slippers, trying to navigate her way out of the very narrow streets. Now, the camera follows the child wearing a yellowed uniform 2 sizes too big for her on her way to school. And just as she steps out of the neighborhood, there's this cut shot to an ominous group of dark clouds moving into frame. A voiceover tells us of this small child and her big dreams, and right then she reaches the bank of an angry, roaring river. And as if on cue, the rain starts pouring. Now, this represents the literal and metaphorical river this child needs to cross to get an education. Her one ticket out of a life of poverty. Her one shot at success. Now, I don't think you have any trouble picturing that, right? Because we've seen it. We've heard stories of these. We've read so many articles published about resilience, which is our topic today. And we've seen, heard, read stories like these, and Filipino resilience has been celebrated, glorified, right? Not just here in the Philippines, but even all over the world. Now, images of people smiling and waving while riding makeshift rafts on flooded streets, people waving at the helicopter while they are sitting on top of their submerged home, children picking whatever was left in the debris after a fire, a landslide, a typhoon, whatever was in season that time. Families sorting through garbage, looking for things they could sell or maybe use. These are things that immediately come to mind when we talk about Filipino resilience. And they're scattered all over the internet as proof of how we, Filipinos, are a different breed. We can weather any storm, literal or figurative. Hashtag Filipino resilience. Hashtag Filipino pride. Now, the question is this. If resilience is celebrated as a unique Filipino trait, and it's true that it has helped so many generations of Filipinos survive, is it all good then? Is resilience enough? Now, resilience, let's define it first, is the ability to withstand hardship, the ability to bounce back or recover and to adapt to different stressful situations. Now, in material science, resilience is measured by the amount of energy something can absorb and still bounce back to its original state. So 2 words come into mind. Number 1, it's toughness. So if a material is tough, no matter the amount of pressure exerted, it would stay as it is. Now, the other word is elasticity. And I think we're all familiar with this. Do you still remember how to form the star? Right? And all of us who've played with these before know that, if you do it a number of times, maybe too many times, or if you hold the force for too long at a single time, even if this material is elastic, it has a breaking point, right? If I do this, and I don't stop, okay. And I guess anyone who gasped na nangyari na yun sa inyo before, right? It hurts. And when that happens, do we blame the rubber band for its lack of resilience and elasticity? Or do we ask the people for accountability? Those who were able and could have done something to stop the blow, or at least soften it, right? Now, who is to blame? This is not an easy topic. And over the years, the conversation has changed. A quick Google search would show you articles telling people to consider stopping talking about resilience altogether. So there are a lot of articles, thought pieces, tweets, conversations that will happen online coming soon because we're getting into the stormy season sa Philippines. So parating na yan. And romanticizing resilience has negative effects that we are all aware of, right? Romanticizing resilience puts the responsibility of survival squarely and solely on the shoulders of those who are affected, giving those in power who could actually do something a chance to step back instead of carrying that weight or even sharing it. And putting the spotlight on resilience allows incompetence to thrive in the shadows. Only stepping back into the limelight as a special guest, a savior, at the time when they're ready to plaster their names or their faces, or maybe both their names and faces, on the backs of relief trucks and of bags of ayuda, right? So, should we stop talking about resilience? Is it time for Filipinos to maybe even consider boycotting resilience? Maybe we should just stop being resilient, right? Well, but what about hashtag Filipino resilience and hashtag Filipino pride? Now, pride is a fascinating word. Kasi there's this term called survivor's pride, which we'll talk about for a second. And survivor's pride is very important because it plays a role in the narrative of resilience. It's defined as the feeling of accomplishment someone feels after prevailing against adversity. And it's a badge of honor that is worn by those who chose to be a victor instead of being a victim. Now, survivors are often encouraged to talk about what they went through and share the things that they learned, not just to reinforce their own resilience, but to maybe inspire others to be resilient as well. And so the question is, should we stop encouraging survivors to share their stories? Are we supposed to tell them to stop talking about the things they learned? Now, that's where my conflict begins. Because you see, I was raised on stories of resilience. I could even say that stories like these, those were my genesis. Those were my beginning. And they are a huge part of who I am today still. So, let me just share a few things about myself. I'm part of the first generation in my family to live outside the slums of Tondo. Yeah, before it was named Tondo. Okay? I'm the daughter of a mother who was actually the first and only college graduate in her family. And her hands still tremble even when it's not cold. It's a price she had to pay because she had to send herself through school, and all the gigs she could get were being a typist, you know, those old typewriters, and a dishwasher, often on the same night. My mother was able to cross her proverbial river. And I'm also the granddaughter of my wowa. And my wowa was, at the age of 14, married off in exchange of the promise of an education. My great-grandmother told her, "Oh, marry my son and I will send you to school." Now that promise was never fulfilled. And instead, she had to raise 5 children practically on her own in one of the worst places during one of the worst times in the Philippines. She was left on the bank of that river. Now, their stories, their sacrifices, fuel my own passion, my own grit, and what I try to do online and offline until now, which is democratize education. And they taught me the importance of grit and perseverance, things that we all know help people succeed in life. So, When faced with seemingly overwhelming challenges, I draw my strength from those stories. And whenever I meet people who are in a similar circumstance, I try to pass those stories along and try to give them a little bit of hope. Or maybe even more important than that, a sense of faculty, agency, self-efficacy, the permission to dream, which after being an educational content creator for 10 years and even more years before that as a college instructor, it's really the same answer to the same question. What's the hardest thing to teach people? It's actually how to teach them to allow themselves to dream. So I know the power of these stories of resilience. Now, what should we do then? Okay? Now, there are other stories too. And I know that because aside from the stories of empowerment that my grandmother and mother told me, there were other stories. And these stories were different because they were told as whispers. Like soft prayers in the dark. These are stories of playmates, of distant relatives, of neighbors lost, of an entire family wiped out because they ate a batch of rotten fish, which was the only thing they could afford at that time. And so many faceless, nameless people who could easily be one of my elders who were gone too soon. And even worse than that, there are stories that will remain untold. After all, the dead do not get to share their stories. So, how can we stare at the face of the survivors, take in what they learned, honor their sacrifices, and still keep ourselves from romanticizing resilience? That's the dilemma. Can we celebrate? Am I even allowed to talk about these generations of women who carried my entire family on their shoulders without forcing other people to carry the weight of their own family survival squarely and solely on theirs? Can I take resilience into account and still have enough energy to hold those in power accountable? Is that possible? Now, in a world divided by polarization, where we face false dilemmas left and right, what can we do? Now, as an educational content creator, there's something that I encourage you to think about, which is this. We could start compounding resilience to stop compounding it. Let me explain. Now, compounding is a rather fascinating word because it has multiple meanings. Now, the first one is to compound, to bind together, or to join, as is in the case of compound sentences and chemical compounds. And the other definition of compounding is to make things worse, to make its worst negative aspects shine, as is in the case of compounding interest on loans, which I think none of us want, right? Okay. But the compounding that I encourage us to do is more in the context of language. After all, resilience is not an easy thing to talk about. And the sentence, Filipinos are resilient, is a simple sentence. A simple sentence that does not encompass the entirety of what it means. So let's scrap that simple sentence and turn it into a compound one, okay? Now, a compound sentence, by definition, connects two different, self-sufficient, and equally important thoughts. And it shows a clear connection between those two things. Now, the easiest way, and I know you probably learned this in grade school, to compound a sentence is to do this. Basically, you don't end the first sentence with a period, and instead turn that into a comma and add an end. An end instead of the end. So when we talk about Filipino resilience, maybe we could start thinking about this. Filipinos are resilient, yes? Now, 35% of Gen Z Filipinos experience depression. a higher number than those who experience it on a global scale. Both are true, and both can be true together. So instead of looking at them as two separate sentences, two separate simple sentences, let's turn that period into a comma and add an end. Filipinos are resilient, and still, Gen Z struggle with depression. Now, Filipinos are resilient, and the Philippines is ranked 115th out of 180 countries in perceived levels of public sector corruption. And Filipinos are resilient. And students in the Philippines remain among the world's weakest in math, reading, and science. Both true, both equally important. Filipinos are resilient. And we deserve better, right? Now, in the conversation surrounding resilience, we cannot neglect one word, which is diskarte, right? And as a kid, I was told that diskarte is a Filipino word that doesn't have a direct English translation. Now, it's fascinating because even if there are close words like innovation, creativity, and resourcefulness, they're not exactly the same as diskarte. But, fun fact, there is a Spanish word, descarte, that sounds an awful lot like discarte, right? But descarte means something totally different. It means to discard, to throw away. Now, before we go any further, this next bit is just pure speculation, okay? It's just my own thoughts, so don't quote me on this. But here's a proposal on a possible origin of discarte. Okay? Now, have you ever wondered why some Filipino desserts use egg yolks and not egg whites, like leche flan, for example? Now, you see, some of the churches that were built here in the Philippines during the Spanish colonial rule actually used egg whites as a binding agent, along with lime, sand, and water. And in my imagination, I think it's not too far-fetched to think that there were Filipinos, maybe an aling nena, who brought hundreds of her eggs to the site and then was told to just pick out the egg whites and discard the egg yolks. And out of that discarded pile came some of the most beautiful Filipino desserts. What was discarded became discarte. Now, let's think about that for a minute. And I love that idea because for so long, Filipinos all over the world have managed to turn trash into treasure. We've managed to turn tragedy into triumph. And we've managed to turn descarte into discarte. So we've showed the entire world what Filipinos can do with nothing, right? So what if we are given something? What can we do with something? So the challenge is this. And I encourage you to think about this every time you engage, especially online, in a climate that is divided, to think of a way to compound things. Let's compound resilience so as to stop compounding, making it worse, compounding it. Because resilience doesn't need to be the end. We could always add an end. Thank you for listening.